shayateen. So I ask you, such a severe statement is against which group? Such a severe statement is against what particular illness and what particular disease? We see the disease of question and the illness of question that we are talking about here is none other than israf. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about israf in the Holy Quran, He says, those of us who engage in israf, ikhwan shayateen, the brothers of the shayateen. Therefore, we look at ourselves, and first of all, as ever, we define our term. After we define our term, we move forward and see is this something that we are engaging in? Is this something that we are involving ourselves in? Is this something that is taking us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We understand that there are hadith upon hadith from the Ahlul Bayt that talk about the dangers of this particular sin, that talk about the dangers of this particular action. For example, we have it on the authority of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he mentions that the individuals who engage in this, they are considered of the most lowly of those who are alive. Therefore, we're saying that there is an increasingly exaggerated, to some degree, and an increasingly emphasized point that we bring when we talk about israf. And it is brought time and time again. However, the discussion that we need to have, of course, is what does it mean? What does it mean for an individual to engage in israf? What does it mean for an individual to be called a musrif? What is a person who engages in israf, and what form does that take? So when we think of israf, of course, we understand that israf means extravagance. Extravagance in any form, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is arguing against it. Extravagance in any form, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that this is something that is against the ummah of the prophets. We see that when we look at Islam, Islam has always been advertised as a religion of balance. We go neither too much on this end or too much on that end. So an individual, for example, who is a bakhil, which is our sin for one of the discussions, has gone too much on one end of the spectrum. An individual who does israf is too much on the other end of the spectrum. We see that an individual who has attained balance is the person in the middle. An individual who has ta'adul is a person in the middle. Therefore, us as human beings, when we are trying to follow upon the ummah of the Holy Prophet himself, we see that our responsibility is to maintain this balance. Therefore, someone who engages in israf, we see that they have taken that balance off. They have taken that balance away. They have foregone that balance in the form of extravagance. However, we ask ourselves the question now, what is this extravagance? What form does it take? And how can we understand if we are engaging it? Again, we look at the tradition of our dear Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala, where he states that sometimes an individual who is poor, they engage in more israf than an individual who is rich. When we look at this tradition, then we start to understand what the definition of israf is. We see israf, of course, is extravagance, and extravagance within inside our own means. For example, if I have a particular means, and I now start spending outside of it, if I have a particular means, and I now start working outside of it, we can see that this particular act is explicitly israf. So therefore, everyone has a different pool, and everyone has a different environment. Therefore, within inside that, we need to understand that am I working or living outside of my means, or am I working or living inside of my means? And we see that, of course, the point that I keep on mentioning over these last few days of social media, and the reason why, for example, this is incredibly dangerous is because it glosses over everything with this false equality, where everyone is now judged by the same metric. That if you don't have this item, then you're not socially valuable. If you don't have that item, you're not socially valuable. If you're not driving this car, then you're not socially valuable. If you're not living in that area, you're not socially valuable. Everyone is individual. Everyone is individual. We see for each particular person and each particular individual, the discussion is entirely different. But when we gloss everyone over with exactly the same measure, when we gloss everyone over with exactly the same metric, we are now throwing caution to the wind and saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's apportionment is incorrect. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's apportionment is lesser or lower than ours, a'udhu billah. So we see that when we talk about the differences between people, the ma'asumeen have told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us different bounties and different barakat. For example, when we look at an individual who is wealthy, the community may say, or an individual may say, look how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them. When you look at an individual who does not have as much material wealth, look at how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is tormenting. or punishing them. And we usually say this is a result of something they've done. Astaghfirullah. Right? If someone is going through a challenge or if someone is going through difficulty, we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not happy with them. We have it on the authority of the same Imam that we have been mentioning, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, where he speaks repetitively about this point, and he says that you look at people who have material wealth and say they are successful. And you look at people who are in poverty and say they are unsuccessful. When in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it might be the exact opposite. That the imtihan for the individual who has wealth is his money. And the imtihan with the individual with poverty is that particular faqr. So we see that it's by no means a blessing an individual having this much abundance of wealth, because there is more accountability. We see, why is it the case of the Ma'sumin? Why is it the case that Imam Hassan bankrupted himself on 3 occasions? Why? Because there's accountability with this mal. This doesn't belong to us, does it? Whatever we have, whatever we possess, it does not belong to us. It's an amana. This amana and this trust has been given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, when we pass away, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask us, I gave you this amana, what did you do with it? If we have an extensive portfolio, each and everything will have to be justified. However, if we see we have relinquished our attachments to the dunya, our accountability is of course much to a lower extent. I spoke about Allama Tabatabai rahmatullahi alayhi a few nights ago, where I stated that all he left behind was a stick of shoes and some books. Now that's all he is accountable for. So on Yawm al-Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask, what is it that you bought on earth and what is it that you left behind? Alam will say, I had these things and this is how I can justify them. And this is how I can account for them. This is how I use the amana that you have given me to get closer to you. So now we ask ourselves the question, all of the ni'mat and the barakat that we have been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can we, for each and every individual thing, truly justify that we bought this thing in order to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If we can, well and good. If we can't, we ask ourselves the question, that are we using the trust that has been given to us properly, or are we using the trust that has been given to us improperly? We see that, of course, an individual who has more resources, they have more mas'uliyah. An individual who has more resources, they have more responsibility. So therefore, if we have more resources, we see the responsibility is given to us in regards to how do we justify this amana. For example, if I give you something, this is an amana. Afterwards, when this is used, you will come back to me and say that this is how I justified the use of your amana. This is what I did and this is how I used it. And if it's justifiable, we say, okay, it was well used. And if it wasn't, we will say that you've squandered all the wealth. You've squandered all the resources. So therefore, when we look at ourselves and we look at material attachment, we see the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so adamant against us not having them is not just because He doesn't want us to have nice things. It's because one, we see they become the source of our worship. And two, we then need to account and justify them on Yawm al-Qiyamah. That I bought this thing for this reason. And it got me closer towards you. It said when Sayyid Khomeini, rahmatullah alayh, was exiled, if you would remember. After, of course, before the revolution in Iran, he was exiled. He tried to go to a few countries, Muslim countries, but they did not accept, and then he ended up in France. When he went to France, of course, when we want to move from one place to another, how extensive is we have to get removal vans, and we have to get people coming in, and we have to get, for example, our whole lives in order. Even if we have to move from one floor to another floor, we see there is so much mal, and there are so much things, resources that are coming with us. Sayyid Khomeini, when he had to shift his entire life to France, what did he take? A briefcase. And it had a Quran in it. That was it. And a clock and maybe a watch. That was the degree of his resources. He said, this is all I need. I don't need anything more. When we look at ourselves, brothers and sisters, can we say that we can genuinely live on that same means? We can genuinely live without need of anything else. And if we say that, oh, we can't live without this or we can't live without that, that now becomes a shackle for me. I am now imprisoned by that thing. We see that the comforts that we have brought in our day-to-day life, the comforts that we have brought for ease of accessibility, they have now chained us because we are now dependent on them. We purchase something and it's now easy for us to use. We purchase something and it's now good for us to use. And after a point in time, we become dependent on them to the degree that when that is taken away from us, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. When individuals say, oh, I can't live without this item, or I can't live without that item, it should be, I can't live without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything else is secondary. So therefore, if we understand that the products and the items and the things in our lives are things that are chaining us back, we see it's important for us to take a step away. Which is why, for example, our Holy Prophet, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, Allahumma salli ala, used to spend time in the cave and also used to spend time amongst the people, because there had to be a detachment of the things that we're used to. There has to be a detachment of the routine that we are in. We're in the same routine for the entire year. We get so attached to the things that we're used to. We don't understand that we are so dependent upon them. However, only when we come out of our routine do we understand, oh, I was actually so dependent upon this. For example, like when we go on ziyarah. When we go on ziyarah, we see our life is entirely different. And we're like, oh, for example, I missed this particular thing, or I missed that particular thing. Or, for example, I used to have this coffee machine, I used to make coffee in the morning, I'm missing that. So I used to, for example, do this particular thing every weekend, and I'm missing that. We see we actually start to understand the change these things have upon us. And it's only when we come out that we understand the dependency that we have on them. It's never when you're in water, you can't see water, correct? It's only when you're outside water can you actually view it properly. But when we're inside our attachments and we're inside our dependencies, we can never actually understand that these are the things that are training us and taking us back. Therefore, it's important for us to make sure that we bring a break into our routine, which is the purpose of Ramadan, a break into our routine. How much, alhamdulillah, have we benefited from the holy month itself? Where we see that there are habits that we go through the entire year, and it's only when we change everything for a month are we now brought to our attention, wow, I was actually dependent upon this thing, I was actually dependent upon that thing, and I have no need of it whatsoever. So therefore, our responsibility in this particular month, our responsibility in the final nights of Shahr Ramadan, we see that it's only when we understand that israf is a trait that belongs to an individual who engages in excess. We must bring ourselves out of our habit loops and out of our habit patterns, and only then can we actually move forward. My teacher in Hawza, there's something that he used to say. Whenever we recite salawat, we always say وَعَجِّلْ فَرَجَهُمْ at the end, right? He says, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil. We say, we always state this, alhamdulillah, وَعَجِّلْ فَرَجَهُمْ, a beautiful dua. This is of the greatest of all the du'as that we can say, right? However, he said, sometimes, when you recite a salawat, don't say وَعَجِّلْ فَرَجَهُمْ. I was like, why? He said, because now we just do it out of routine. Now we don't even think about the coming of the Imam. Now we don't even have that passion of the hastening of the Imam. It's just become a normal routine part of our salawat, and therefore our thought process isn't even engaged anymore. Only when you come out of the process can you see it properly. Only when you pause from something can you understand it. Only when you take a break can we see the bigger picture. Therefore, when it comes to us, our time has come to an end, therefore we must end our discussion. We see that our responsibility when it comes to israf, our responsibility when it comes to eliminating this particular disease from our hearts is to see, are we engaging in this extravagance? Whatever it may be. It might be financial extravagance. I don't need this. The question when we purchase anything should always be, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, can I justify this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If it's yes, so be it. If it's no, then we must move on. So therefore, us who engage in extravagance, or us who engage in excess, we see that whether that's in financial matters, whether that's in food, whether that's in time, whether that's in any array of matters we see extravagance as something that goes in any particular discussion. Someone may be extravagant with their time, have israf with their time. They may waste their time, right? This is an israf. And it comes from the same root. They may waste, for example, their food. This is a waste. And it comes from the same root. They may waste, for example, their money. That's israf, and it comes from the same root. So therefore we see that the rizq Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, whether it's in the form of food, we can't waste this. We can't engage in extravagance, because this extravagance will then cause us to be very bad in our financial matters, our temporal matters, how we spend our time and how we spend our life. Therefore, it's our responsibility, brothers and sisters, for us to understand israf is a disease that takes us further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, before we engage in anything, we need to ask ourselves, am I acting in a balanced way, or am I acting in an extravagant way? And if I'm acting in an extravagant way, we see this balance is against the tenets of Tawheed, and it's against the teachings of Rasulullah and Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So therefore we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to rid this disease from all of us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to grant shifa to all the mareed. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon all the souls who have passed away. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the attendees of this majlis. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to bless the facilitators of this majlis. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al-Asr wa Zaman. عجل الله تعالى فرج الشريف وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين صلوات على محمد وآله الطاهرين.
السلام عليك يا نبي الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين سيد الوصيين إمام المتقين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى أم المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك، عليك مني جميعا سلام الله عبدا ما بقيت وبكي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليك يا شهداء كربلاء جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء، سلطان أبا الحسن مولانا علي بن موسى الرضا، كن شفينا وشفي والدينا في يوم الجزاء. السلام عليك وعلى أختك فاطمة المعصومة ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وظهورك واجعلنا من أنصارك وشيعتك ومحبيك. السلام عليك وعلى آبائك الطاهرين ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل الساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد.
one cup.